Imagine you are standing on the deck of a massive wooden ship, the smell of sea salt mingling with gunpowder, the sails stretched by the wind, and the waves crashing violently against the hull. This is not a leisure trip. It is the place of survival for hundreds of people across the ocean on a monster weighing more than 3,500 tons, HMS Victory, a glorious symbol of the Royal Navy and also a testament to human strength, skill, and the madness of the 18th century. Tonight, we will open the door of time together, exploring how blocks of wood, ropes, and bronze cannons could create one of the greatest war machines ever built. If you love authentic historical stories where glory and suffering share the same deck, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and watch until the end of the video, because this voyage will make you see old sailing ships in a completely different way. Now, fasten the anchor ropes, turn off the lights, and let history tell the story of the seas. However, to truly understand what HMS Victory is, not just a symbol or a name echoing through textbooks, we must look deeper at the price paid to turn the dream of an empire into reality. For this ship was not born from inspiration or loyalty, but from an obsession with power, an oak declaration that England would not only dominate the seas, but make the entire ocean tremble in fear. Yet this pride began with a scene quite far from grandeur: Chatham Dockyard, where earth, tar, and sweat mingled into the distinctive scent of ambition and exhaustion. More than 6,000 oak trees were felled, each once a shade of the ancient forest, now transformed into the skeleton of a monster. Every axe stroke, every saw mark was a step toward glory, and also a step away from reason. None of the workers knew exactly what they were building. No blueprints, no precise measuring tools, not even scientific knowledge. Only the blind belief that if the wood was thick enough, it would not sink. To imagine the process, you could think of assembling a giant IKEA furniture set in a storm with no instructions and everyone drunk. Yet somehow they did it. Blacksmiths hammered each nail by hand. Carpenters bent every piece of wood with steam and fire. And when someone got injured, they just plastered tar over the wound and kept working. This was not bravery. It was desperation organized into a system. When the ship was launched in 1765, cheers rang out, not from pride, but because it did not sink immediately. Standing over 65 meters tall, carrying 104 cannons and nearly 800 men, Victory was a floating skyscraper made of wood. It was an engineering feat, but also evidence of what the English at the time called optimistic pragmatism. The rest of the world called it reckless. The hull was thick enough to withstand small cannon fire, but that also made it move like a drunken whale. Top speed, 8 knots, meaning if you ran fast, you could overtake it. But in the eyes of the nobility, it was mobile marvel of God. One witness at the launch wrote, "As I watched it slide down the slipway, I felt as if I were witnessing a cathedral set to sea." Romantic as it sounds, it captured the essence. Victory was a floating cathedral, where national pride was carved into every plank and every screw a prayer that it would not split apart in the ocean. But what made HMS Victory legendary was not just its size, it was the absurdity it embodied. In the 18th century, every warship was a strange combination of physics and superstition. People believed that using oak from ancient forests would make the ship as sturdy as the soul of Mother England. And when it was finished, priests came to bless it, praying it would withstand storms. For at the time, prayer was the only technology that could replace radar. Every plank of Victory was cut, fired, and fitted by hundreds of men, whose dental records, if they existed, would consist of one word: none. They worked under oil lamps in smoke, amid saws, hammers, and the smell of rum. No one asked if the work was safe. If you fell into the hold, they might just close the hatch and continue, for the wood needed to fill the gap. There were no occupational safety regulations then, only don't die where people are working. When Victory finally slid into the water, all of Chatham Dockyard held its breath. The ship tilted slightly, then stabilized. And in that moment, England got what it had long desired: a symbol of invincibility. From afar, it looked elegant, majestic, but stepping onto the deck, you would realize it was a machine of survival, powered by sweat, blood, and rum. Inside, the space was a maze of wood and rope. The decks were layered like a giant lasagna. The top layer, bright, airy, and sunlit, reserved for officers and formal ceremonies. The middle layer, dark, stifling, where cannons lay dormant like beasts asleep waiting to be called. And the lowest, dark, damp, where water seeped through the planks and rats became close companions. Every inch of the ship had a purpose. Where there was no gunpowder, there was food. Where there were no cannons, there was rum. Sailors' sleeping quarters were just big enough to curl up. Ventilation was nearly non existent. Air circulated only when someone opened the powder magazine doors, and the smell, a mixture of sweat, wet skin, mold, and dried fish, a scent no perfume could replicate. But what made victory terrifying was not the space or living conditions. It was the fact that it worked. No machinery, no engines, only 37 sails, and over 26 miles of rope. Every rope had a name, and every name was an order. An officer would shout, "Reinforce the mainmast top," and dozens would spring into action. No one truly understood what the order meant, but all knew that getting it wrong could mean death. Victory's masts were as tall as apartment buildings, requiring sailors to climb with bare hands amid storms. No safety harnesses, no protective gear. One slip meant falling into the sea, and your name would be erased from the duty roster immediately. The pulley system worked like a living machine, tense, jerking, screeching, twisting, all composing a chaotic symphony of human effort and wind. Strangely, amidst the madness, there was an indescribable beauty. When the wind blew just right, sails full, and the ship leaned into motion, you could feel it, the soul of the ocean, both fierce and free. Sailors called it victory singing, the sound of wood vibrating, ropes humming, and waves keeping rhythm. In that moment, the ship came alive. No longer a massive heap of oak, but a sea creature of flesh and bone, born from pride, fear, and the indomitable human will. And that is what makes HMS Victory a legend. It was not just an engineering feat, but a symbol of an era, a time when humans dared to challenge the ocean with what they had, their hands, their courage, and an unyielding belief that they were born to conquer. If there was one thing that maintained order on HMS Victory amidst an ocean full of rum and despair, it was discipline, a force never lacking even when provisions, fresh water, or reasons to live had run out. The Royal Navy believed that fear was the best cement to bind loyalty. Therefore, any misstep, from being late for watch to whistling out of rhythm, could be punished with the lash, confinement in irons, or worse, keel hauling, dragging the offender under the hull through barnacles and iron spikes, a reminder that the sea never forgives. Every sailor knew the cat o' nine tails, the nine-tailed whip, salted to ensure the pain was sharper than the sting of regret. Punishments were carried out publicly, not to exact vengeance, but to teach everyone the consequences of having humanity. Silence fell as the person was tied to the mast, and the whip cracked like the drumbeat of death. No one dared intervene, not out of lack of compassion, but because everyone knew that tomorrow they could be in the same position. But discipline was not just fear. It was the only glue keeping the ship from falling apart amid storms and cannon fire. Within this harsh order, HMS Victory operated like a living body, each man a muscle, each rope a vein, and each command a heartbeat. When the alarm bell rang, everyone knew their position. No questions, no thinking, just action. Within minutes, chaos turned into cold precision. 104 cannons loaded, gun ports swung open, and the ship became a roaring machine of destruction. Battle was not just gunfire and smoke. It was a meticulously organized collective madness. Each cannon required a team of 6, one to load, one to ignite, one to pull the firing cord, and the remaining 3 to pray. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and flying splinters. Each shot a deafening blast that shook the deck. Ears ringing, eyes stinging, mouths filled with gunpowder, yet no one stopped. They were not only firing at the enemy, but at their own fear. When HMS Victory engaged in the legendary Battle of Trafalgar, the roar of 100 cannons firing simultaneously echoed like the thunder of an empire. Each 24-pound iron shot was capable of tearing apart the opponent's wooden hull and crushing anyone nearby. Yet, amidst the smoke, the screams, and flying debris, there was order. Admiral Nelson, the legendary commander of Victory, stood resolute at the line between life and death, issuing orders with a calm, chilling voice. He did not shout, for everyone could hear his command clearly in their minds. England expects that every man will do his duty. And they did. Not for money, not for glory, but because in that moment, amid fire and storm, Duty was the only thing that made them feel alive. They pulled ropes, loaded cannons, rescued wounded comrades, all while their feet slipped on blood and seawater. Some lost arms, some lost legs, but no one abandoned their post. The surgeon, working in a low, blood-stained, rum-scented room, operated amid screams, sawing, stitching hastily, pouring rum on wounds as a ritual. No anesthesia, only courage. When the sun set after a day of battle, the ship still stood, the hull riddled with cannon holes, sails shredded, and the deck a miniature battlefield. Yet victory remained afloat, pressing forward, carrying the symbol of England. For the crew, that was what mattered most. For as long as the ship survived, so did they. In the night, as the smoke cleared and the wind calmed, the survivors gathered by the oil lamps, holding trembling cups of rum. They did not speak of victory, nor sing triumphant songs. They remained silent, for survival itself was an achievement. Um, some cleaned cannons, some stitched torn sails, some stared at the sea, eyes empty but as deep as the ocean. In that world of wood, ropes, and gunpowder, no one was truly a hero. Only ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. The 18th century called them sailors, but they were gears in the vast machine of history, the force that propelled England to become a dominant naval power. And HMS Victory, with scars etched deep into its hull, stands as living proof of the price of glory. Every cannon hole, every charred plank tells a story of courage, fear, and in the madness of humans trying to control the uncontrollable, the sea. Today, Victory still exists, moored as an immortal symbol. Visitors step onto the deck, inhale the scent of aged wood, and think of the deeds performed. But if they listen closely, they may hear whispers from below the floorboards, the voices of hundreds of souls who lived, fought, and died on this wooden monster. These sounds are not complaints. They are a reminder. History is written not just with ink, but with blood, sweat, and even laughter in the heart of a stormy night. When the battle truly began, every sound on Victory merged into a choral apocalypse. The drum signals echoed through the wooden frame, the officers' shouts were swallowed by the roar of the cannons, and beneath it all was the sound of the ship itself, groaning, shaking, alive. It was not just the music of war, but the heartbeat of an artificial machine powered by sweat, blood, and enough rum to ignite an entire fleet. With every firing, the deck shuddered violently as if coughing. The 32-pounder cannon recoiled, black smoke thickened, the smell of sulfur and gunpowder rising so dense you could taste war. The men, many of whom had never been chosen to sail before, now stood shoulder to shoulder, pulling ropes, loading guns, and shouting orders they could not hear. No one was an individual anymore. They were parts of the victory machine, operating in a frantic rhythm between life and death. On deck, officers carried swords, not to fight, but to maintain order. They shouted hoarse, sometimes merely to suppress spreading panic. Some commanders no longer needed to yell. Their gaze alone was enough to make sailors pull the cannons faster, simply because they knew the consequences of delay were worse than enemy fire. In the distance, masts swayed in the smoky haze, the British flag flapped, a symbol of pride and pure stubbornness. With every cannon blast, wood splintered like a rain of knives. Oak shattered, sending hundreds of fragments through flesh like bullets. It is said most casualties in naval battles did not come from cannonballs, but from the ship itself, the wooden monster fighting back against those who controlled it. When someone was wounded, they were not removed from duty. They were dragged across the deck, set aside, and someone else took their place. There was no time for grief, only time to fire again. Below deck, the powder monkeys continued to rush through smoke and shadows. They were the smallest souls of the ship, running across wet decks, carrying gunpowder bags like beating hearts. Some boys had never seen a sunrise without peering through a gun port. To them, war held no concept of glory, only orders and ringing ears. If lucky to survive, they would return with small bodies, but the minds of the aged. Meanwhile, beneath the deck, the surgeon began his own battle. The saw rang out like a musical accompaniment to the cannon chorus. Severed arms and legs piled up, floating in the red-stained seawater across the floor. He could not pause to think of the suffering, only action, swift and decisive. Next, he shouted like a craftsman in death's factory. Above, officers discussed strategy. Below, he performed miracles with a rusty saw. Amid the smoke and explosions, the ship seemed to forget it was wood. It became a steel creature, plunging into the wind, cutting through waves, enduring everything poured upon it. They say each strong recoil of the cannon pushed victory back an inch, but the sailors' courage propelled it forward a mile. They fired not just with gunpowder, but with the fear of being forgotten. On the command deck, the admiral shouted orders. Sweat, salt, and gunpowder dust clung to his coat like armor. Each decision he made was the boundary between victory and a grave beneath the sea. He knew it. Everyone on the ship knew it. But no one stopped to tremble. Fear was a luxury left ashore. At some point, all sounds merged. The wind's wail, splintering wood, human shouts, and cannon fire became a single symphony, the symphony of survival. You could no longer distinguish the ship's voice from the humans. Victory breathed, groaned, and sometimes roared like a wounded beast still fighting. Then, as the smoke cleared, the sun broke through the dense haze of gunpowder, revealing a deck that looked like hell on earth. Black scorch marks marred the wood, water and blood mixed as one. The survivors leaned on each other, eyes empty yet glimmering with a strange light, the relief of still being alive. In that fragile silence, they did not cheer. They only breathed, for even breathing was a victory. After the battle, the hull was temporarily patched, wounds stitched with thread and hope. The deck was scrubbed, the cannons oiled again. Life on Victory returned as if no blood had been spilled. Everything was cleaned except the memories. The marks on the wood, cuts, burns, bloodstains became the ship's diary, proof that it had lived, endured, and triumphed. And when night fell over the sea, the sailors gathered again, raising cups of rum in silence, not to celebrate, but to commemorate. They did not speak of victory, nor of the enemy. They merely gazed at the sky, where stars reflected on the black water, and thought, perhaps, that here, amid rotting wood and stormy waves, they had found the meaning of being human. For in the end, victory was not just a ship. It was a testament to the endless endurance of mankind, that amidst smoke, explosions, and fear, we can still stand, fire one more shot, and call it glory. The sea that morning was far from peaceful. It roared, churned, and reflected a world gone mad amidst smoke and blood. On the deck of Victory, every torn sail, every taut rope stretched like human sinew, and every scorched oak plank still groaned in the heat. The entire ship, once a symbol of engineering and power, now resembled a wounded giant, victorious yet uncertain how long it would survive. Nelson lay below deck, his breath growing weak. Above him, cheers still rang out, mingled with coughs, cries, and the fading sound of cannons. He could not see the victory he had forged, but he felt it, through the smell of gunpowder, burnt wood, and the ship's slow heartbeat. When an officer reported the triumph, Nelson merely smiled faintly. He knew history had recorded victory, and simultaneously had taken away the remnants of humanity left on its deck. Above, the sun pierced the smoke and mist, revealing the aftermath of Trafalgar, drifting wrecks, charred ropes, shredded sails, and tiny figures struggling to patch together life with trembling hands. There was no triumphant music, only the sea wind whistling through empty gunports, composing an endless funeral march. Yet if the British excelled at anything more than fighting, it was pretending everything was fine. When news of the victory reached London, people rejoiced, hailed Nelson as a new saint of England, erected statues, wrote poems, and named generations after him. Meanwhile, those actually on Victory only wished for a meal not tainted with gunpowder. History prefers beautiful stories, and it had taken blood to write the legend. As Victory limped back to Portsmouth, the ship resembled a drifting ghost in the fog. Survivors patched it with planks and prayers. Below, Nelson's body lay in a barrel of brandy, not for ritual, but as the only way for him to return home intact. Perhaps no hero had ever been embalmed in pride and ethanol simultaneously. The scene upon Victory's arrival at the port was strange. The crowd cheered at the sight of the heroic ship, but those aboard only stared back with empty eyes. They knew that between glory and disaster, the line was no thicker than a plank of oak. Shaking hands still clutched the anchor ropes, and the clinking of chains in the water whispered the farewell of an era. Yet Victory never truly rested. England would not allow it. When the cannon fire subsided, the ship was repurposed. From a symbol of war, it became a floating barracks, then a storehouse, then a mobile office at sea. Its glory was replaced with the smell of mildew, and young officers who had once dreamed of serving aboard the legendary warship now only used it to record inventories. What had been raised to conquer the world now held ropes and brooms. Over time, the wood rotted, masts leaned, and oysters clung to the hull as if history were corroding itself. People debated whether to dismantle Victory. Yet the fear of losing a symbol prevailed. We cannot discard Victory, they said. It saved the country. And so the ship was preserved, or rather, left to endure under the guise of preservation. By the late 19th century, Victory became a hybrid of temple, warehouse, and a musty reminder that glory is never free. Visitors smelled the lingering scent of rum in the wood and wondered how many souls still drifted within each oak plank. Then, in 1922, England, now having learned how to transform memory into heritage, hauled Victory into dry dock. The ship was no longer a weapon, but a story in wood, a living chronicle. During World War II, German bombs fell nearby, and people joked, if it survived Trafalgar, these bombs are just a light breakfast. Indeed, it stood firm. Perhaps stubbornness was part of British design. Today, when you step onto Victory, you are not merely stepping onto a relic, but onto a collective obsession. Every scratch, every cannon hole, every bent plank beneath your feet bears witness to centuries of survival. The scent of oak mingled with sea salt and linseed oil is as pungent as if time had never passed. Children gaze at the gleaming black cannons and imagine rolling thunder. Adults peer at the deck's stitched repairs, wondering how many once lay there, and the ship remains silent, like an old man who has seen too much to need words. For Victory is not just England's triumph, it is the triumph of memory over oblivion, a reminder that behind every medal, every monument, lie trembling hands, groans, and the last pours of rum to forget the scent of blood. And as you leave the deck, stepping back into the 21st century, remember, whenever the sea wind blows through Portsmouth Dockyard, it is not just wind. It is the breath of Victory, still alive, still telling its story, still whispering to those who listen that glory is the only thing we cannot carry away, yet it is the only thing that keeps us alive. When the first dawn broke over the Sogdian Mountains, where mist still clung to the sheer cliffs, Alexander of Macedonia was more than a king. He was the living embodiment of an unquenchable desire, conquest. But that morning, before him, was something that no map, no sword could define: Roxana. She appeared as if the very mountains themselves had carved her form, proud, aloof, and radiant. In the instant their eyes met, something strange happened. A man who had subdued thousands of fortresses was now subdued by a single glance. Alexander's empire was built on the principles of military reason and absolute victory, but Roxana was a reminder that even a man praised by philosophers as the descendant of Zeus could not escape the primal power of human emotion. To his generals, the king pausing mid-campaign to marry a Bactrian girl was madness. Yet Alexander had never been merely a military man. He was a thinker, and his love, like everything else he did, was political, philosophical, and carried the ambition of an entire civilization. During the wedding ritual, when he broke bread and shared it with her, it was not merely symbolic. It was a union between East and West, between conqueror and conquered, between cultures thought never to harmonize. In the firelight, the Macedonian soldiers watched silently. They did not understand why their king, who had once been indifferent to thousands of deaths, now softened before a girl. But Alexander knew better than they imagined. He understood that true power did not come from steel, but from the ability to make others believe they were part of something greater. Roxana, in her new role, was not a passive captive granted favor. She became part of Alexander's dream, an empire unified not merely by sword, but by harmony. Historians would later debate whether it was true love or strategy. Yet one thing was undeniable: Roxana altered the course of the Macedonian Empire. After their wedding, Alexander began wearing Persian robes, conducting Eastern rituals, and treating Asian nobles as equals to the Greeks. This displeased many of his generals, but to Alexander it was the first step toward a timeless vision, where peoples were no longer divided by borders, but united by a common ideal. Roxana was no passive figure in this story. She was intelligent, sharp, and quickly learned to live between two worlds, both as the wife of a Greek king and as a symbol of Eastern wisdom. In the camp, soldiers called her the Little Star, not merely for her name Roxana, but for the calm and quiet light she brought to Alexander during long campaigns. As Alexander pushed deeper into Asia through deserts and jungles, she was always by his side, not just as a wife, but as a mirror reflecting the ideals he pursued. Yet that love carried an inevitable tragedy. The closer Alexander came to his dream of a united world, the farther he drifted from those who once trusted him. Trusted generals began whispering, simmering rebellions spread. In their eyes, the king who once symbolized the Greek spirit was slowly becoming a foreigner. But Roxana understood. She knew that to create a new world, sometimes one must be willing to lose oneself. And she stood beside him, silently, witnessing greatness transform into solitude. When Alexander died in Babylon at only 32, Roxana lost more than a husband. She lost her purpose. The vast empire collapsed even before its founder could lay a firm foundation. Amid power-hungry generals, she became the remaining symbol of an unfinished dream. Bearing Alexander's child, the sole heir to the empire, she was hunted, exploited, and ultimately driven toward tragedy. Yet, though her fate ended in blood and darkness, the name Roxana endured, not as a victim, but as a witness. For her story was not merely a tale of love. It was proof that even in the harshest eras of conquest, there was room for compassion, for the desire to heal, and for dreaming of a unified world. Alexander once said, "Nothing is impossible to the man who dares." And perhaps, in the moment he saw Roxana, he dared the hardest thing of all, to love amidst war, to seek peace amidst conquest. Today, when we speak of Alexander the Great, we remember maps, victories, and collapsing empires. But behind it all is the figure of a Bactrian girl, the one who made a king pause his conquest of the world, only to realize there are things greater than power. That is connection, empathy, the ability to see oneself in another. And if Alexander is the symbol of boundless ambition, Roxana is the reminder that every empire, no matter how grand, must ultimately learn to yield to the heart. As Alexander advanced further into the east, the path he walked seemed no longer paved with victories, but with illusions. His greatness, once forged from Aristotle's ideals and faith in destiny, began to mingle with the loneliness of a man who had gone too far to turn back. Roxana saw it more clearly than anyone. His eyes, once alight with the desire to conquer, now reflected an obsession, a divine yearning to deify himself. The man she had once loved, who had smiled while sharing a loaf of bread across the Bactrian desert, was now seeking to become a living god among mortals. During long nights on the Indian frontier, Alexander would sit in his tent, staring at a mottled map. Outside, the heavy rain of the jungle fell on soaked canvas, and by the flickering lamp, Roxana silently watched him. She was no longer the timid girl she once had been. She had become a woman who understood that power and loneliness always walked hand in hand. She knew that deep within the conquering king was a child afraid to stop, for if he stopped, he would have to confront himself. After the battle with Porus, when his soldiers refused to march further, Alexander raged, but Roxana only looked at him with understanding. "Perhaps," she said softly, "a great conqueror is not the one who goes the farthest, but the one who knows when to stop." Her words, light as the wind, lingered in his mind, but Alexander did not know how to stop. To him, stopping meant death. When the army returned to Babylon, glory had faded, leaving only the shadows of themselves. Disease, loss, and suspicion pervaded the ranks. Roxana, amid her husband's fevers, remained calm. She cared for him, wiping his brow with wet cloths and striving to keep the lamp by his bed burning through the night. Outside, the generals whispered among themselves, while she, a foreign woman among political wolves, had only one weapon: love. In his final days, Alexander seemed to sense what was coming. He dreamt of strange signs: birds falling from the sky, tears upon statues of gods. It is said that the night before he died, he looked at Roxana for a long time and said, "If I am no longer, tell them that I have seen the world, and the world has seen me." Then he smiled, a weary smile, as if accepting both his greatness and the tragedy of himself. Alexander's death shattered his empire like glass. With no clear successor, the generals plunged into a vortex of power. Roxana, then pregnant, suddenly became the center of a political storm. Within her womb was Alexander's only child, the legitimate heir to the greatest empire the world had ever known. But to protect the child's life, she had to learn to become what she had never been: a survivor in a world of ruthless men. Roxana fled with her newborn son, Alexander IV, through the cities that once cheered for his father's name. Everywhere she went, she saw monuments smashed, paintings honoring him burned, and former generals proclaiming themselves kings. An empire once built on the aspiration of unity now crumbled into greed and betrayal. And amid it all, there was only her, the young widow carrying the memory of a fallen king, still trying to preserve his spirit. It is said that in the following years she rarely spoke to anyone. Roxana became silent, living like a ghost among the ruins of the empire. Her little son, Alexander IV, was protected but also imprisoned, a living symbol of power that everyone desired but no one truly respected. And she, surrounded by those who only saw her as a tool, understood that her love for Alexander had become both a curse and the final comfort. In her later years, Roxana lived under the supervision of Cassander, one of the most malicious enemies of her husband. And in a world with no king to whom she could be loyal, she had only her memories. The woman who had once made Alexander see the world differently was now imprisoned in silence. Yet in that silence, she preserved the most precious thing, their story. Not the story of a king and a queen, but of two people, one relentlessly chasing glory and one teaching him to see humanity within himself. When Cassander ordered the killing of Roxana and her son to extinguish Alexander's bloodline, it is said that she did not scream. She only requested one thing, to be buried beside her husband. Perhaps she knew that in history they would never truly be separated. And indeed, her name still resonates, not for power or beauty, but for the meaning she brought. Roxana is a symbol of a simple and eternal truth, that even the greatest, when reaching the pinnacle of power, still need someone to remind them of human nature, where love, loyalty, and loss intertwine. Alexander conquered the world, and Roxana conquered the heart of the man who sought to rule it. And while the empires he built crumbled, their story endures, like a gentle echo in history, where war and love meet in the same breath. Under the gray skies of the north, where the sea crashed against the cliffs like drums heralding doom, Lindisfarne remained immersed in the quiet rhythm of prayer. The world outside, however, had begun to shift violently. Far to the north, across snow-covered and wind-swept lands, longships had departed the Norwegian fjords, carrying men whom history would call by a single name, the Vikings. They came not for faith, but for survival. Failed harvests, barren lands, and ambitions that could not be restrained drove them south, toward fertile lands where gold and treasure were piled high in monasteries like Lindisfarne. That day, the sea rumbled as if forewarning something. The monks, as usual, awoke in the morning mist, chanting prayers. No one anticipated that black sails were advancing from the horizon. Dragon ships, carved with ferocious heads, lunged forward like spears on the water, swift, precise, and powerful. On deck, golden-haired warriors, clad in leather armor, wielding axes and round shields, eyes bright as steel. They did not come to preach, but to plunder. And in that instant, Europe's peaceful religious world was abruptly torn apart. Church bells rang, not to summon prayer, but to alarm. The monks scrambled toward the gate, but it was futile. Wooden doors were smashed open, and within minutes the Lord's sanctuary was filled with screams. Blood spilled onto stone floors. Scriptures, rare manuscripts inscribed in gold, were torn and thrown into the fire. An elderly monk knelt, clutching a cross, and was struck down by an axe without hesitation. Survivors were bound, dragged onto ships as slaves. Lindisfarne, the jewel of the north, had become the opening nightmare of the Viking Age. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was the day God turned away. For the Vikings, it was merely the beginning of a tradition, where strength and courage were honored above all commandments. Yet the truth lay between these worlds. The Vikings were not the mindless savages chronicled by Christian annals. They were farmers, traders, and skilled seafarers, driven by harsh nature. They lived in small coastal villages and from childhood learned to row, fight, and believed that fame on the battlefield was the path to Valhalla, the paradise of the warriors. What the Anglo-Saxons called the Lindisfarne Massacre was, in fact, the first testament to maritime technology the European world had never seen. Their ships, long, light, and fast, could move both by sail and oar. With shallow hulls, they could penetrate deep into rivers, strike at the heart of the continent, and retreat before armies could respond. Each ship was a mobile storm, carrying around 60 warriors, a family, or even an entire tribe. And on these ships, Viking culture began to spread across Northern Europe, not only by acts, but through a mindset of conquest and exploration. After Lindisfarne, England was no longer a peaceful land. In the following decades, hundreds of coastal villages burned under Viking fire. Yet, along with war came cultural fusion. Many Vikings settled, married local women, brought customs, language, and shipbuilding and metallurgy skills. They did not merely plunder, they built, traded, and sowed the seeds for a new economy. Cities like York, Dublin, and Kiev would later bear the marks of their hands. However, to the monks and peasants of the time, the image of the Vikings remained terrifying. They were men from the northern darkness, carrying the scent of salt, blood, and foreign myth, a world of Odin, Thor, and mighty Valkyries. To the Christian Europeans, they were symbols of evil, but to themselves, it was merely the path to assert existence in a harsh world. They believed that dying in battle was not a tragedy, but glory, escorted by Valkyries to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight forever. In the centuries that followed, accounts of Lindisfarne became warnings. Yet from there, Europeans began to learn from their enemy. They improved ships, fortified coastal defenses, and completely transformed their approach to warfare. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 not only marked the beginning of the Viking Age, it signaled the end of an era of isolation. From that point, Northern Europe entered a period of intense interaction, where trade, war, and culture intertwined into a new current of history. When the last fires on Lindisfarne faded, their ashes drifted far, across the North Sea, reaching the lands where the Vikings would set foot, from the coasts of France to the Mediterranean, even to the distant rivers of ancient Russia. No one could have imagined that those once called barbarians would be the very ones laying the foundations of medieval Europe. Today, when we look back at Lindisfarne, we see not only destruction, but birth of an era, a civilization forged from the ashes of faith and the fire of war. And perhaps among all the axes, waves, and chants, history is merely whispering one thing: no peace endures if the harshness of the sea is forgotten, where every Viking ship set sail not just to plunder, but to seek the meaning of human existence itself. Although shrouded in mist and terror, the Lindisfarne raid of 793 was not merely a bloody chapter of history. It was the opening of a new era where religious, political, and technological forces clashed violently, creating a wholly transformed Europe. The Anglo-Saxons, trembling before the North Sea storm, recorded in their chronicles, a dreadful omen appeared in the sky over Northumbria. Stars burned, dragons soared, and then famine and war descended. Yet behind these terrifying words lay a truth few understood at the time. The Vikings were not merely destroyers, but pioneers of the first globalization in human history. From the cold villages along the coasts of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the Vikings saw the world not as a limit, but as an invitation. They were born amidst harsh winters, where barren lands could not sustain a growing generation. For them, setting sail was not just an action, it was instinctual survival. While medieval Europeans still saw the sea as a barrier, the Vikings regarded it as a path to destiny. Their oak longships, light, long, and flexible, were the culmination of centuries of experience. Shallow hulls allowed them to land anywhere with water only knee-deep. No fortress, no port was safe from their appearance. What set the Vikings apart was not only their weapons, but their strategic thinking. Every raid was calculated based on wind, tide, and religious timing. They struck when monks were praying, in the misty morning when church bells mingled with the waves. They understood that surprise was a second god. Not only did they land, but they also moved upstream, raiding deep into the European interior, where people never thought the sea could reach. Soon after Lindisfarne, similar raids spread across the coasts of England, France, Ireland, and Scotland, like the first cracks in the ice of old Europe. But if one only views the Vikings through axes and blood, a greater truth is missed. They were the finest seafarers of the pre-Roman era. They navigated not with compasses, which Europe would understand centuries later, but with sunstones, calcite crystals capable of refracting sunlight even in fog, allowing them to determine direction at sea. When venturing farther, they used crows, releasing them to find land. And it was through these crude but ingenious technologies that they opened intercontinental trade routes, from Scandinavia to Byzantium, from Iceland to as far as North America. Those whom the monks called Odin's barbarians actually created a trade network broader than Rome. On the Volga River, they traded furs, amber, and slaves. In Constantinople, they served as mercenaries for the Byzantine emperor. In England, they exchanged silver, jewelry, and wine. Cities like Dublin, York, and Novgorod, later great cultural centers, all originated from Viking camps. They were the ones connecting the world, not through doctrine, but through practice and the will to survive. While the West remained immersed in the Bible, the Vikings laid the first foundations of Europe's maritime economy. And though they never considered themselves explorers, their journeys surpassed imagination. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, reached Vinland, now Newfoundland, Canada, 500 years before Columbus was born. This proves that the Viking spirit of conquest was not limited by violence, but by the belief that the world was far vaster than what the eyes could see. However, to understand why Lindisfarne became a turning point, one must look at the spiritual significance of the site. The monastery was not just a place of prayer, it was the religious heart of England, housing the relics of St. Cuthbert and gospel manuscripts written in gold. When it was destroyed, the Anglo-Saxons felt as though God himself had been violated. They saw in the Vikings the image of the devil, not because of their actions, but because of what they symbolized: freedom, ambition, and power, unbound by belief. It was also the moment Europe learned a harsh lesson. Faith alone could not protect them from the real world. Lindisfarne forced Western kingdoms to change. They began building navies, fortifying castles, and organizing armies in unprecedented ways. Even kings and lords adopted Viking tactics, moving flexibly, striking fast, and withdrawing efficiently. The nightmare of 793, in another sense, awakened an entire continent. Ironically, those considered enemies of Christianity became the catalyst for its expansion. As Vikings settled in England and France, they gradually converted, married locals, built villages, founded towns, and ultimately became defenders of the faith their ancestors once destroyed. The descendants of the warriors who ravaged Lindisfarne later became the Normans, who conquered England in 1066 and laid the foundation for the modern nation. Thus, the plunder of Lindisfarne was not merely a tragedy, it was the first violent encounter between two worlds: faith and survival, light and darkness, the civilized South and the wild North. Amid blood and ashes, a new Europe was born, stronger, bolder, and no longer afraid of the sea. Therefore, when we hear the distant echoes of Viking horns, we do not hear only the call of war. It is the echo of a people who believe that life is not given, it must be seized with blood, waves, and an unyielding will. In the years following the Lindisfarne raid, the fear that the Vikings instilled no longer remained confined to distant coastlines, but seeped deep into every village and city of England and northern Europe. King Ethelred of Northumbria, despite his efforts to strengthen defenses and send warnings to other monasteries, still had to witness the impotence of royal power before the fury from the north. Monasteries, once considered spiritual refuges and symbols of Christian faith, now became easy targets for longships, hidden in the mist. Every echo of the dawn, every wave striking the shore, reminded survivors of the horrors of Lindisfarne, forcing the monks carrying St. Cuthbert's relics to wander in search of shelter, moving through a silence heavier than any sermon. For the Vikings, however, the fear of the South was merely proof of their power and the choices of the gods. They did not view Lindisfarne as a singular raid, but as a declaration of their own authority and that of the Norse deities. News of stolen treasures, slain monks, and the mournful silence of coastal villages became catalysts, igniting a desire to sail in the hearts of young Scandinavian men. They saw in Anglerand, the wealthy and unprotected lands, an opportunity to test fate, to prove courage and glory, where each voyage was a gamble with death, yet promised eternal fame. From Norway and Denmark to distant islands, news of Lindisfarne spread at astonishing speed. The coasts of England became lands of unease. Any black sail appearing on the horizon was enough to send people fleeing inland for refuge. Bishops sent letters lamenting horrors never before witnessed, but to the Vikings, these laments were merely the background music of fate. They looked at wealthy, unprotected monasteries and saw in them Odin and Thor's invitation, a challenge to prove personal and communal strength, an opportunity to affirm that courage, not cowardice, determined the value of life. The longships, technical marvels of the age, symbolize the combination of nautical genius and military strategy. With shallow hulls, long and light bodies, they could glide across the sea, move deep into rivers, and even be dragged overland. Speed, silence, and the ability to appear unexpectedly left the Anglo-Saxons unprepared. No coastline, no wall could resist them. Wealthy monasteries became attractions not only for gold and silver, but also as opportunities to test the northern gods and demonstrate personal strength. In each raid, the Vikings did not merely plunder, but also learned and adapted, opening trade routes, establishing settlement networks, and even influencing the power structures of Europe. Their terror and brutality were evidenced in every detail. Wooden towers set ablaze, relics taken away, the agonized cries of monks echoing through the night. But behind this severity lay a different value system: glory, honor, and loyalty to the Norse gods. They believed that victory on the battlefield brought not only wealth, but also the path to Valhalla, where heroes were welcomed by Odin eternally. The fear felt by the Anglo-Saxons was only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath lay an entire world of beliefs and culture, where war and spirituality intertwined, creating an irresistible force. As Viking fleets repeatedly appeared along the coasts of England, Ireland, Scotland, and France, Europe gradually realized that these were not isolated attacks. Each raid was a vivid lesson in the fragility of power and social organization. Kingdoms had to learn to build defenses, strengthen military forces, and, more importantly, understand that fear and insecurity were a form of power to contend with. The Vikings, through speed, precision, and knowledge of terrain, turned Western weaknesses into weapons. Beyond war, Viking voyages were opportunities to explore and connect the world. They traded furs, amber, slaves, and precious metals. They established new towns, married locals, creating enduring cultural and commercial centers. This made them pioneers, opening intercontinental maritime routes, even if their methods began with violence. It was the initial acts of plunder from Lindisfarne to other monasteries that laid the groundwork for a comprehensive transformation of medieval Europe, politically, militarily, economically, and culturally. The true power of the Vikings lay in their ability to turn death and fear into motivation. They faced challenges, did not succumb to danger, and believed that fate, determined by the gods, was irresistible. Rituals before setting sail, offering sacrifices, reading runes, seeking divine guidance, were not merely religious forms, but psychological preparation for what lay ahead, turning each voyage into a combination of strategy, faith, and communal strength. As a result, Europe underwent a profound transformation. Kingdoms had to adapt, monasteries had to defend themselves, and people learned to confront fear in ways never before seen. Lindisfarne and the subsequent raids were not only tragedies for the survivors, but also historical lessons in power, courage, and adaptability. The Vikings, once seen as barbarians, became symbols of an era where the sea was no longer a boundary but an opportunity, where glory was measured by bravery, and where destiny, strangely enough, was rewritten by those who dared to sail. Thus, from a bloody morning on a desolate island, Lindisfarne became the first roar of a new era, the Age of the Vikings, where fear, violence, faith, and exploration intertwined, shaping the fate of an entire continent for decades to come. Every wave, every black sail appearing on the horizon was no longer merely a sign of plunder, but the drumbeat of a waking world, where history was written in blood, sweat, and an unyielding will. Amid the vast fields and majestic mountains of the Urians, life seemed to move in harmony with every shift of the earth and sky. Their space was not merely a place of dwelling, but a spiritual map, where every sound, scent, and breath carried sacred meaning. From the early days of spring, when grass and trees began to sprout, to the autumn when grains ripened, each moment was a reminder of the connection between humans and the cosmos. The Urians believed that all life was woven from invisible threads, linking people, livestock, plants, rivers, and hills, and every event in the material world reflected a spiritual order. They made no distinction between the divine and the earthly, for divinity existed in every drop of water, in every heartbeat, in every breath. Thanks to this belief, every action of the Urians, from sowing and harvesting to marriage and warfare, carried a sacredness, a significance beyond mere mortal existence. Women held a central role in Urian society. They were not only bearers of offspring, but also intermediaries between Mother Earth and humanity, living symbols of the endless cycle of creation. They participated in full moon rituals, dancing, singing, and performing gentle offerings to please the spirits of the land. It was through these rituals that the Urians learned to respect and fear life, understanding that prosperity came only from the generosity of the earth, and that all human power must be accompanied by reverence. Fertility deities were symbolized through serpents, bulls, or images of women with full hips and breasts, representing both physical strength and the cycle of rebirth and cosmic order. In every ritual, every movement, every whispered word was seen as a collaboration with the divine, an effort to maintain the eternal cycle of life. The Urians did not only focus on fertility, they also viewed war, death, and violence through a sacred lens. Like the Vikings, they believed that venturing into danger was a way to demonstrate courage and faith in the cosmic order. But unlike the raiding voyages of the North, the Urians sought balance. A Urian warrior did not go to battle for gold or fame, but to protect the community, to maintain the rhythm of life, and to demonstrate the unity between humans and nature. Their war rituals combined military skill and sacred elements. Drums, smoke, chants, and the light of sacred hayfires created a space where life and death merged, allowing each warrior to step onto the battlefield as a part of the moving universe. Remarkably, the Urians understood the power of symbols and tradition. They carved their stories into stone, commemorated the names of heroes, and preserved songs that endured alongside flesh and bone. Each symbol was not merely decorative, but a vessel of spiritual energy, reminding future generations of courage, intelligence, and adaptability. In their eyes, recounting the tales of warriors or harvest festivals was akin to extending the cycle of life, helping the community remember that survival depended on the connection between divinity, humans, and the land. When Lindisfarne rang out as the first strike of the Vikings in the West, the Urians viewed the event through a different lens. They saw in it a power akin to their own life rhythm, where courage, mythology, and the will to master fate blended into one. The Vikings set sail with black sails, axes, and ironclad resolve, while the Urians relied on the rhythm of the earth, on thunder, and on fertility. Both cultures understood that the world was not for the fearful, that death was only truly frightening when humans did not know how to use it to create meaning. Lindisfarne, therefore, was not only the beginning of the Viking Age, but also a historical lesson on spiritual strength and how belief shapes action. Over time, influences from both civilizations began to intertwine. The Vikings gradually learned to settle, build, marry local inhabitants, and participate in trade networks. The Urians, in turn, realized that mobility, adaptability, and individual courage were essential to survive amidst new forces. Yet at their core, belief, ritual, and connection with the cosmos remained their foundation, forming a steadfast identity that no invader or catastrophe could break. The rituals, songs, and stories passed from generation to generation created a cultural and spiritual treasury. The Urians understood that every seed sown in the fields, every chant, every offering, was a reverberation of creation itself. It was this perspective that allowed them to live without fear, love endlessly, and make death a part of the endless narrative of existence. While Lindisfarne marked the direct clash between the North and Christian Europe, the Urians exemplified another way, living in harmony with the forces of nature, connecting with the divine, and turning every action into a resonance with the universe. Through all ages, the story of Lindisfarne and people like the Urians reminds us that history is shaped not only by weapons and victories, but also by deep beliefs, respected cycles of survival, and the ability to find meaning in every moment. It is the difference between living a mundane life and living as part of the universe, where every action from sowing seeds to raising sails carries the sacred heartbeat of life, and every person can write their own story in the endless epic of the world. Beneath the pale dawn of the Western Balkan Mountains, the life of the Urians unfolded like a living epic, where every breath, every step, and every gesture resonated with sacred rhythm. For them, the world was not defined by sin or fall, but by the desire to create, to flourish, and to connect with the cosmos. At the heart of Urian spirituality were the goddesses of fertility, powerful primordial figures who governed both the womb and the world, embodiments of life and power. They did not sit on distant thrones, but lived in the earth, in the stones, in the water, and in the breath of humans. Reverence for them was not based on fear, but on deep intimacy, a resonance between body, nature, and divinity. These goddesses were simultaneously mothers, protectors, lovers, and destroyers. The human life cycle was reflected in their forms, which led the Urians to worship sacred femininity as a living, omnipotent force. Archaeologists have unearthed clay figurines across the Western Balkans, full bodied, wide hipped, round bellied, with curved backs, sometimes entwined with snakes. Each curve was not merely an artistic detail, but a symbol of power and abundance, reminding that life always sprouts from even the simplest forms. The snake, coiled and winding across the statues and decorations, was not a threat, but a living symbol of rebirth, eternal cycles, where death was merely a doorway to new life. Among the goddesses, Pren stood out as the deity of love, marriage, and solar vitality, comparable to Aphrodite or Venus, but imbued with greater sacred power. She was not merely a protector of romance, but a guardian of life's renewal, overseeing childbirth, nurturing, and the cultivation of life energy. Flowers, honey, milk, and fire were offerings to her, symbolizing the connection between humans and the cosmos. Pren did not exist alone. Around her were more earthly goddesses, overseeing the land, decay, caves, and the secrets of ancestors. For the Urians, life and death always went hand in hand. Seeds must die before they sprout, and all growth depended on reverence and ritual. Even the mighty warriors, skilled and courageous, bowed to these goddesses. Women carried their images in tattoos, talismans, and their very bodies became sacred landscapes, where the blood of femininity flowed like the heartbeat of Mother Earth. The Urians needed no temple to connect with the divine. They lived among the gods, breathing with the earth, the water, and their own bodies. The snake appeared everywhere, on pottery, weapons, house foundations, and even in graves, reminding that death was not an end, but a continuation, and every living act was part of the eternal creative cycle. The snake also represented masculine energy, strength, and passion, but it was always balanced with the nurturing feminine energy from the earth. In fertility rituals, men and women harmonized, painting or tattooing snakes on their bodies, reminding that passion, sexuality, and creativity were not sins, but tools to sustain the universe. This combination was not limited to ritual. It permeated daily life, from marriage to labor, from sowing seeds to hunting, all infused with cosmic rhythm. In a Urian wedding, the groom offered a plow or wheat, while the bride circled the hearth 3 times to honor the goddess of home in the womb, each act extending the sacred cycle of creation. Each season had its own rituals, blending sexuality, gratitude, and reverence. Spring was the season of awakening. Snow melted, fires were lit on hilltops, maidens danced barefoot, invoking Pren to grant fertility and love. Red ochre decorated the body, symbolizing blood, life force, and sacred existence. In many festivals, couples were encouraged to unite, believing that love and passion reflected the rebirth of Mother Earth, a sacred offering to the gods. Offerings included grains, honey, milk, and animal sacrifices, with blood falling to the ground as nourishment for the spirits below, ensuring abundant harvests. Priests and wise women presided, chanting in ancient languages, connecting human breath with divine will. Even marriage and childbirth, personal expressions of life, were integrated into this cosmological rhythm. The Urians understood that the body was a living altar where creative energy flowed, where natural and cosmic cycles were honored. Women, in particular, embodied Mother Earth, life, healing, and sustenance. Every curve, every bodily rhythm corresponded to lunar cycles, seasonal change, and fertility. Through it all, the Urian world appeared as a vivid tableau where every person was part of the cosmic story, where sexuality, reproduction, and ritual merged with the pulse of the earth and divine energy. This profound belief not only shaped a sustainable society, but also created a lasting culture, where history, tradition, and faith were written with blood, fire for the land and sky. The Urians did not merely live, they harmonized with the universe, transforming every act into a sacred gesture, keeping the flow of creation in perpetual motion, endless and vibrant. Under the pale dawn, when the mist still lingered in the valleys and the ground remained damp from the night's rain, the Urians began their day with a profound awareness of the connection between humans, the land, and the divine. They made no distinction between the worldly and the divine. Every object, every action, every breath bore the mark of sacredness. The maturation of each individual, particularly women, was marked by tattooing rituals, an ancient custom preserved through generations. These tattoos, made from soot and natural pigments, were not mere decorations. They were spiritual marks, declarations of power and roles within the universe's creative cycle. Spiral patterns symbolized rebirth, diamonds represented generative energy, and snakes provided sacred protection, reminding the Urians that every living being was enveloped by the protective forces of Mother Earth. Women's tattoos were a dialogue with the spirits, tangible evidence of their dual role, both nurturer and priestess of life. Some tattoos were performed during fertility festivals, when the community gathered around sacred fires to offer prayers for abundant harvests and healthy children. Others related to marriage, conception, or childbirth, showing that the pain of the needle was sacred, a small death, opening the door to transformation, allowing the woman to enter a state of deep connection with the cycle of life. Men also participated in this custom, often tattooing snakes or suns to symbolize strength, integrity, and their role in maintaining cosmic balance. However, tattooing was more intimately associated with women, as they were the center of rebirth and the continuity of life's flow. For the Urians, the body was not merely physical, but a direct manifestation of the sacred world. Acts of love were not mere passion, but rituals, a communion between masculine and feminine energies, between humans and the divine. When two bodies met, the boundary between the mortal and the divine dissolved. Desire became a form of worship, a way to honor life and creative energy. The man represented celestial bodies, the sun, storms, and fire awakening life, while the woman symbolized the earth, where seeds take root and sprout. Their union was a balanced encounter of two cosmic principles, where energy and matter, seed and soil, harmonized to create new life. During harvest festivals, this belief was vividly expressed. Couples were chosen to represent deities and fertility, participating in symbolic rituals with milk, honey, and bread, where food not only nourished the body but also carried the essence of the earth and the life energy of the divine. These rituals were not confined to temples. They took place in the fields, by rivers, and atop hills, where Mother Earth and the gods could witness and accept them. Every spring, when the snow melted and green shoots emerged, young women danced, weaving wildflowers into their hair, their bodies adorned with red ochre, symbolizing blood, vitality, and divine energy. In many festivals, couples were encouraged to unite, believing that human love and passion reflected the rebirth of Mother Earth. The Urians respected both the light and dark aspects of life. Spirits, the land, and unseen beings were ever present, and all rituals aimed to maintain balance among these forces. Temples were often modest. They could be caves, wells, or standing stones, where snake spirits were worshipped with offerings such as milk, eggs, honey, or carved snake figurines. The snake, winding from the underworld to the living world, was a sacred messenger, protecting fertility and carrying human prayers to the heavens. Harming a snake was an offense to the divine, while respecting them brought blessings and prosperity. Even within households, small altars existed, where ancestral and snake spirits were nourished with daily offerings. Wise women and priestesses served as intermediaries between humans and spirits, guiding fertility rituals, granting talismans, and interpreting dreams, ensuring that life and death maintained a balanced relationship. They wielded power that commanded both respect and awe. A single curse or blessing from them could alter the harvest or the fate of the community. Funeral rites also reflected this profound understanding. The dead were not seen as complete losses, but as returning to Mother Earth, to their origins, to continue the cycle of life and death. They were buried with offerings, grains, milk, honey, to nourish the soul on its journey to the underworld. Snake imagery in the graves protected the departed, reminding that human reproductive power and sacred authority persisted even after death. Death was metamorphosis, transformation, an essential part of the ongoing cycle of creation, like the shedding of a snake's skin. All aspects of Urian life, from birth to harvest, from love to death, participated in an endless cosmic rhythm, where every seed, every flower, every kiss, and every drop of blood contributed to sustaining the sacred cycle. This balance was not mere theory, but a lived journey, inscribed in tattoos, offerings, rituals, and the human body itself. Their world was one where every living being was reminded that life and death were not opposites but integrated, together composing the eternal story of creation. For the Urians, every gesture was sacred, from sowing seeds to intimacy, from spring dances to funerals. Every act connected humans with the gods, Mother Earth, and the vast cosmos. In this world, life was not a fleeting phenomenon, but continuous creation, where past, present, and future converged, and every generation, from children to elders, participated in the eternal dance of creation. This is the Urian identity, a culture that not only lived by reverence, but expressed creativity and sacred energy in every breath of its people and the land. Across the vast fields and rolling hills of the Balkans, where the morning light filters through thin mist and the wind carries the scent of damp earth, the spiritual heritage of the Urians remains, faint yet enduring. They left no grand temples or inscribed tomes. Instead, their philosophy of life, death, and reproductive energy was inscribed directly into the body, the land, and the rhythm of daily life. Every step, every breath, every ritual was a harmony between humans and the sacred world. The Urians understood that nothing in the universe is wasted. All energy is reborn. From the death of the previous season, from decayed seeds, from those who have passed, life always finds a way to return, abundant and full of new energy. One of their most remarkable legacies was the practice of tattooing, especially for women, as a sacred declaration of reproductive power and their role in the creative cycle. Tattoos were made with soot and natural pigments, depicting spirals, coiled snakes, suns, or diamonds, each carrying profound meaning. Spirals symbolized the cycle of rebirth, snakes were protective spirits, and diamonds represented generative energy. These marks were not only personal, but also served as bridges between generations, where knowledge, power, and reverence were passed from mother to daughter. In a world where the body was the canvas of the gods, every needle stroke, pigment, and engraving told a story, a prayer, a hymn about connection with Mother Earth. According to Urian philosophy, sex and reproduction were neither to be hidden nor shameful, but were sacred rituals, harmonizing male and female energy, humanity, and the divine. When men and women united, they exchanged not only their bodies, but also life and creative energy. This union mirrored the cycles of heaven and earth, rain and seed, sun and Mother Earth, creating a vibrant cosmic rhythm. During spring festivals, couples were chosen to represent deities, performing symbolic rituals with milk, honey, bread, and seeds, reflecting the belief that human love and desire were energies that helped renew the world, bringing blessings to the land and harvests. Sacredness existed not only in festivals, it permeated every interaction with earth, water, and fire. Wells, stones, tree roots, and river bends all had spirits back, and the Urians knew that living in harmony with these spirits maintained prosperity and vitality. Small household altars, where snake figures and ancestral spirits were nourished with milk, bread, or other offerings, reminded them that even the smallest actions were sacred, from sowing seeds and lighting fires to intimate gestures and sexual acts. Even death in the Urian worldview was not an end. It was a return to Mother Earth, a transition in the eternal cycle of life. Ancient graves show the deceased buried with offerings such as grains, milk, and honey, sometimes accompanied by snake imagery or spiral ornaments, reminding that the power to give life continued even after passing. Funerals were not despairing. They were rituals acknowledging the integration of death and life, where fire and water symbolized twin forces of purification and rebirth. Fire guided the soul, water nourished unseen forces. The earth received all and returned life. What made the Urians unique was not only their reverence for reproduction or death, but also their refusal to separate the sacred from desire. Sex, love, and longing were not sins. They were sacred tools that allowed the world to sustain itself. Every kiss, every intimate gesture, every offering to the gods was part of the cosmic rhythm, where life and death, humans and the land, body and soul were unified. Even when Rome invaded their lands and temples were buried, when languages and gods were replaced by new names, Urian philosophy endured quietly. Reverence for Mother Earth, the snake, and fertility goddesses survived in folk traditions, spring festivals, marriage rituals, and embroidered symbols on traditional garments. Women still tattooed crosses or dots on their hands as reminders of protection and fertility. Farmers poured wine onto the ground during the first plowing. Newlyweds circled the hearth 3 times, all cultural legacies from the Urians, a reminder that sacred desire and connection with the cosmos never vanished. In their world, there was no distance between humans, divinity, and nature. Living was reverence, loving was ritual, birthing was creation, and dying was returning. Every small action, from breathing the earth and sky to sharing a kiss, was an expression of the eternal rhythm preserved by the Urians. The harmony of body kept spirit, and land created a resilient philosophy, where sacred longing, creative energy, and reverence for nature accompanied humanity through all ages. The echoes of the Urian world still resonate in the fields of Albania, Montenegro, and Bosnia, reminding us that before portals in the heavens appeared, the divine was present in the earth and within us, and that desire, love, reproduction, and death have always been part of the same cosmic rhythm. The Urians have departed, but their spirit, philosophy, and devotion quietly endure, like the endless flow of the snake, like the heartbeat of Mother Earth, a promise that life and sacredness have never ended.